Just on and all of you are welcome to jump into that. So he did make a lot of emphasis on the user pay, and how important that was to that. And South Africa is a nation, and we are strategists of note. If there's no type of strategy and white paper we do not own in this country, but it's getting that paperwork into action and implementing it, but also getting the necessary commitment from all these different players to play their part. How do you all believe government could communicate more effectively or promote and advocate more effectively for all of us as stakeholders really to come to the table and advocate for this pro-growth approach that they want to now take as we move into the year?
I personally would literally just say you lead by example. I really think that it's a confidence game for the most part, and the biggest ability or the ability for anybody to want to do more, invest more, give more, whether it be the private sector as well who want to get involved, or even if it's just us as citizens want to get more involved. If you're seeing it from a government level, if you're seeing the leadership sort of lead that desire to want to grow, to enhance the economy a whole lot more, you'll definitely want to then chip in and say, well, it's worthwhile. There's an adage that I like to use and say, I wouldn't mind giving more than the current taxes we currently give at any point in time if I was able to go to any hospital I wanted to and receive the kind of healthcare we all need, or go to a school and receive the kind of education we needed. So if it's led from that point of view, and I say lead, not necessarily always just action. And what I mean is policies can be in place to help that confidence from the private sector or even just citizens as well.
Jesse, back to the principle of cared for capital and our investments in that particular space. And really, as we have this macro conversation about triple Ps and bulk infrastructure in the country, I know that it will be the young woman who has a construction or an engineering company, or the young man who owns a landscaping outfit, or the young scientist who comes up with a new product and innovation that might save us on energy costs, who will also be just as pivotal to making sure that these deliverables are not only landed and embedded in the ground, but are also sustained and managed. In fact, in the minister's speech this afternoon, he made the point about asset management, and asset management from the perspective that as communities and societies and economic participants, we actually looked after the infrastructure that we were surrounded by. How does small business, do you also believe, as we now talk about the participants at this very big table, get nearer to the table? Because I think it almost becomes quite disheartening to be an owner of a relatively young business, but a business that has the right level of energy and innovation and skills even, that keeps thinking that it's actually being kept further and further and further away from this main table, simply because of the size of the numbers that are being bandied about, or the level of the conversation when it typically sits at national government and at task teams, as opposed to more localized facilitated forums. How do small business get to that? And can big business, who already sits at this table, bring them a little bit closer into this cycle? Because I really, really see, also back to the point that Chantal was making, in terms of if everybody is playing a part and everybody is working towards something and has a piece to contribute, that we all reap the return on these type of investments, even if they are minuscule investments.
Some of the earlier points, you were saying, how do we go from a bit more conceptual, strategic stuff to actual tactical execution? In much the same way, and we're seeing a lot of this now, we're involved in many different programs and projects, and in much the same way, we've seen the need for role models in society. So we've always spoken about it. We need to have the right leaders, the right entrepreneurs, the next Elon Musks and whoever, to basically inspire other entrepreneurs and to create these role models. We also need to have role model businesses. And I think this is something that's just not done nearly enough, is that we need to make it real by actually showing the success stories and making this whole thing come to life, to say, right, there is that lady that you spoke about, here's her story. She started out here. She did this. She did that. Here's the result. And we need to capture that, and we need to play that back more often. So we need to really, as opposed to just having role models and people saying, okay, I want to be like him or her, we actually need to have role model businesses where we can say, that was an incredible success story. You can do it too. And I mean, one of the ones that come to mind now is we've been involved in a wine farm transformation project in the Western Cape with Middelburg and Mzala wines. As FNB, we were really proudly involved, and we put in grant funding and, with the right mentorship and the right handovers and that. And it's a very successful project at the moment now. And we watched the video that's just been made recently of just the story. And we all, yesterday sat back and said, geez, this is what we need. We need more like short video clips like this, where we can play these to the country, and we can say it is possible, here's proof. Don't worry too much about the people involved, okay? But more about the business that's involved, and here's the structure. And I think to your earlier question, just around, how do we help the average entrepreneur to take advantage of these support initiatives, these funding initiatives? I think it's the same answer. Is that if we were to make it real, to say, right, here was a recipient that got some sort of a grant or got some sort of funding, or whatever, tackled it out, made a success of it. Tell their story, play that back, and let hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of other entrepreneurs know how to also do that. So I think we've got to make the whole thing real by idolizing role model businesses at this point, and not necessarily role models, even though they're probably equally important. But there's certainly in the small business and in the medium business world right now, especially in this country where there's so many factors. There's load shedding, there's crime, there's so many things that you can say it's really difficult to run a business in South Africa. I mean, that's not wrong, but the reality is I've got incredible people in this country. We've got incredible entrepreneurs. We've got an incredible, like you said, a strategizing spirit. And sometimes people just need to see the end result in action and say, geez, okay, now the pennies dropped, and now I see what they did. I can also do that.
Well, let's talk about perhaps the scariest citizen in the country, the tax man. The boogeyman that keeps us awake at night and conscious between month end and different periods right throughout the year. So one of the things that came out of the budget speech today was that this year's collections will represent perhaps the largest tax shortfall on record in South African history. And, that's sizable, that's significant. It also does induce some anxiety, because if certain things were crippled or debilitating, it now perhaps gives us that anxiety that, well, will we be able to achieve some of these imperative programs and projects that have been spelt out by the minister in the same speech if we are collecting less revenue? On the upside, some of the tax policy proposals, though, that came through were actually highlights for both the individual as well as business owner, who have really, to all intents and purposes, almost carried the country through the last 11 months, specifically through their contributions. Corporate income tax coming down to 27%. Of course, looking at the personal income tax brackets, and whilst it looks like an increase of 5%, if you really go into the detail related to that, it's not really an increase, and it's really about balancing out inflation. And I really wanted us just to chat about your thoughts related to tax. And maybe let me start with you, Chantal, because Chantal, you had some great insights a little bit earlier on about what some of the tax adjustments mean to the individual. And then I'll bounce back to both you, Arabile, as well as Jessie, as we look at personal tax and some of the implications around that.
I think it's important to just start by saying, even though the revenue shortfall is very large, it is not nearly as large as what the minister envisioned in October. Yeah. So the reality on the ground has been less awful, if I can put it that way, than what was initially anticipated. And that really came in the form of better than expected personal income tax, as well as higher than expected corporate taxes, which did provide a little bit of wiggle room. Because in October, the minister said 40 billion rand needs to come from tax. Yeah. But we actually overshot on their estimates, and we thankfully didn't get any tax increases. And I think both the adjustment for bracket creep, so that just means that your tax bracket is a little bit higher. So if you're at the lower end of the tax bracket, then you will probably fall in a lower tax rate, so you'll get a really nice you'll get nice relief there. I think that'll give consumers a little bit more wiggle room. And then corporate income tax, I think, is brilliant because we do have a very high corporate income tax rate. It is a deterrent to new business, particularly offshore foreign direct investment. And the fact that the minister said this is probably not the last corporate tax adjustment lower, I think is very pro-growth.
It's something.
It's
and
good.
we will take it at this
We
point.
will take it.
Arabile, Chantal made a point about the average South African's basket and how these relief measures actually help the average South African fill that basket to the best of their ability at this point in time. Some of your reflections related to that, because we're also going to see some of these adjustments. The fuel levy will naturally affect and have a creep on consumer goods and that sort of thing. What are your thoughts related to that? Because I mean, the South African basket shrunk dramatically at level 5 lockdown, and then it sort of started to get better. And now, worst of all of our canteen lunches are actually taking place at home.
Which is more beneficial.
And education is taking place at home and the like. So these baskets actually need to be sustainable. Maybe your reflections on that.
Look, I think overall it did feel like a better budget for the consumer in a sense, right? Particularly because of what we've just mentioned now with regards to some of the tax bracket sort of cuts as well, and where you'd fall in the tax bracket. I mean, that could be a massive saving for certain people. As you noted, though, that fuel levy is going to hurt. It does mean that you're going to be paying more. And let's remember, things like the oil price are continuously going higher. The rand is depreciating as well on a more consistent basis, it seems, of late. So it does mean we won't be able to stay having a positive tilt to our baskets. But it does mean that we've changed our basket in the last year, right? As you said, yes, it's gotten smaller, but we've changed the priorities. And that is going to be quite important, because that just means you've now looked at your budget, you've looked at what you can and cannot afford, and even though on a social grant perspective you got minor increases or marginal increases at best, you can still say to yourself, I can possibly change things around. I don't always have to spend as much on transportation now, because that meeting can really just be an email now, and we don't have to actually go all the way there.
Drive to it and dress up for it.
Precisely.
It all costs money to look good, guys. Jesse, the corporate tax decrease will obviously be something that will delight many of your customers. Just your thoughts around that, and particularly around making small business both competitive but also opening businesses attractive.
It's obviously going to be a welcome move on its own. I think it's a smart move. I think that companies have taken quite a knock, so this just gives them some reprieve. I suppose the two caveats to watch out for in there was that there was mention of deductible tax interest expenses as well as the assessed loss. So it'll be interesting to see those dynamics as to what was meant entirely by those. But that being said, I suppose the backdrop, you can't see it in isolation of the rest of the budget speech, which was the strong theme of pay per use, fuel levies and that, which, if you think about it, arguably now are going to find their way most to business as opposed to, let's say, consumer, because like we talked about now, I mean, a lot of consumers and a lot of the individuals have been changing the way they work and maybe traveling less and maybe using less fuel, and maybe, whereas sort of small businesses, if you're running a vehicle or two or a fleet and you've got to be delivering things or you've got to be transporting things, that fuel hike's going to come straight in. And the same being said about whatever might come ahead in terms of pay per use of the infrastructure. Arguably those things indirectly go straight into the bottom line for a business, basically. So I suppose on the one hand, great news on the the corporate tax rate. I think that's a welcome reprieve. I think it's a smart move and signaling the right stuff also to the global business community. At the same time, it's going to be interesting to see then the indirect taxation elements and how they affect the average small business, because I just feel that certainly, fuel hikes and pay per use and all of that certainly going to, attract certainly going to hit small businesses, that's for sure.
And just on the point of fuel, Arabile, from you, we saw a few text smoke screens there from the minister. We looked at syntax, we looked at the carbon fuel levy. But back to infrastructure, of course, without public transport, but you're taxing us for using, finding these points of balance. Your thoughts just around some of the new legislation, some of the reform led conversation related to tax? Your thoughts
Yeah.
on some of the other things we should look out for?
I think for the most part, one, you could take that infrastructure fund predominantly and see how that is going to influence things like transport, because that will be very critical and important. I mean, we thought something like the Gautrain would be immensely helpful, but and very quickly as a sidebar, my huge gripe with the Gautrain is that it's unfortunately helped the people that have the ability to move around, whereas the people that don't have the ability to move around still don't have that. For example, if you live out in the Vaal and work in Sandton, you're still taking 3-4 taxis, whereas if you live in Pretoria and work in Sandton, you can take one Gautrain, yet maybe you also have a car. And that's just a presumption, but the possibility around that. So it's around how exactly you're going to work that infrastructure fund into this as well. In terms of other reforms that are absolutely necessary, we keep speaking about trying to create, in this year now, especially because we've seen things like the African Continental Free Trade Agreement come to the fore, that we want a more friendly sort of tax and trade scenario with the rest of the continent. That's going to be critical as to how does South Africa deal with that, considering the deals that we've had to do with Europe, the United States, how those have gone slightly pear-shaped in some instances as well. So those negotiation skills are going to be important because it keeps you in good standing with other investors who want to, of course, come into South Africa. The vehicle infrastructure model as well in South Africa is going to be very important. The National Automobile Association saying that they believe this year is going to be a bumper year for infrastructure too. So we hope that all those things come up and it will certainly be helpful.